Well, I want to talk a little bit about giving up control today. And obviously, we know who we're giving that up to, right? We're giving that up to God. We're giving up control. It's a difficult matter. It's hard to do. We tend to be control freaks. You know, we want to control everything. And what we discover in the Bible, in a number of different stories, that holding too tightly onto control usually leads us to a rough place. And we see this in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to talk about him today. And that's in Daniel chapter 4, verses 28 through 37. It's all printed there in the outline so you can follow along. But first, let's just look at this verse in the New Testament. It's James 4, 6b through 7a. It says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves then to God. So you can kind of see just from that one verse where we're going with this. So pride is the source of control. And we're all prideful, all of us. There's a certain amount of that is healthy and good. But we tend to cross over that line and make pride almost become a sense of arrogance and overconfidence in our own abilities as humans. And while we absolutely teach people to believe in themselves in a healthy way and so on, it's easy for us to get in that mode where it's all about us. Truth is, that pride is the opposite of submission. And we just don't like to submit, to anyone, much less to God. But we're to submit to God, and the Bible even says we're to submit to each other as servants. We serve God and we serve each other. So pride must be turned into humility, and that's another thing we're not very good at. If somebody's bragging about how humble they are, there you go. But pride must be turned into humility, which allows us to more easily give up control to God. When we're more humble, what I've learned over the years is that whatever I say with humility because I could be wrong. Doesn't mean that I am or I'm not. It just means that I need to have a certain amount of humility because I'm not all-knowing. Somewhere outside my knowledge, there may be some things I don't know. I don't know what I don't know. So we have to start there. Pride is the source of preferences rather than purpose. So that's what we get preferences and purpose mixed up. We have this preference of the way we want to do things, or the way we think things are supposed to be done. And really, what we need to focus on is God's purpose. What's God's purpose in all this? We think that there's so many things in the world that is going to cause this or cause that. Well, how much control are we going to give people? How much control do we give ourselves? The truth is, we don't have any control, really. We don't. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But when our preferences take precedent over God's purpose, we are outside the realm of submitting to God. And many times our preferences are not even biblical. How is Christianity in the Western world, is it more American than it is biblical? Think about that for a moment. So understand that sometimes our preferences are nothing more than cultural, and they're things that we grew up with. That's not necessarily inherently a bad thing, but we need to always examine them. We always need to take a look at them, and we need to do that in light of God's Word because we have to be guided by His Word. Now, it's okay to have them. It's okay to expose them. But it's not okay to impose them. We don't shove things down people's throats. God doesn't even do that. When we do that, it's just more of a prideful thing. It's pride gone bad and humility upended. Pride results in self-protection instead of self-sacrifice. One of the things that's really hard to understand is that when you look at the life of Jesus, he didn't come to survive, he came to sacrifice. So there has to be a certain element in our lives. Now, we're to be living sacrifices. We don't need to go die on a cross. We already got a Messiah. We don't need any more. But we still need to remember that it's about being sacrificial. And this is where we got to become more aware, more self-aware. Because as I said earlier, we're all control freaks to some degree. And I don't think, again, inherently that's necessarily a bad thing as long as we understand where the source of that control is. It needs to be God in our lives. We need to be interdependent upon Him. And while wanting to have things in order and have things in the right place is not inherently bad, what happens is the adversary who's behind all of it, we always think in terms of flesh and blood, but it's the Bible's very clear about that. The battle isn't between flesh and blood. Just to give you an example, no matter who's in the front office in Washington, Jesus is still king. So we need to understand that to a large degree, this is about the adversary dividing us and pitting us against each other. This is what's happening, I think, so much today. The adversary wants to cause division and wants to stifle God's purpose. So we have to always come back to God's plan and God's purpose. If it's about self-preservation and protection, it's probably not about God's purpose, because Jesus didn't come to preserve himself. He came to sacrifice himself. And then in the New Testament, later in the New Testament, we're told we're to be living sacrifices. That's hard. It's kind of the opposite of the way we roll. So it's got to be about God's purpose. And once we get into God's purpose and understand God's purpose, then it's easier to give control to God and realize that, He's on His throne. He's always working, even when we don't see Him working. Obviously, that was proved this morning, was it not? So, God's plan was and always is about self-sacrifice. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is a great example of what happens when we are unwilling to give up control. And his story is in Daniel chapter 4, verses 28 through 30. And this is where we can kind of answer the question, how do we give control to God? Because it's, we deal with difficult people every day. We have to face work every day. We have to, or if you're retired, you still face whatever it is you face. Nobody gets a free pass. But look what it says. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And by the way, all the things that were happening to King Nebuchadnezzar was things that he had done. And because of these things he had done and the fact that he was taking credit for them, that's why all this happened. That's the context of verse 28. So all this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? Now, there's all kinds of things wrong with those words, as you can imagine. The first thing that he did was he was taking credit for what God had blessed him with and had done there in His kingdom. Taking credit for God, for what God has done, is always a mistake. I can't explain to you what happened this morning. I wouldn't even begin to take credit for what God is doing. Because He's the one that does it. But here's what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. The king had a dream, and he was concerned about that dream, and rightly so. So he had Daniel come and interpret the dream. And that's really what the context of this whole chapter is. The king basically did not listen to the warnings that he got in the dream. Daniel was trying to tell him, hey, there's some things that are, if you don't get some things in order here, there's going to be some things that happen, not going to be good. And instead, he let his pride take over. And he took credit for one reason. And it's the only reason why we take credit is because we want control. We just somehow need that control. It gives us security. It's a false security. Because I can tell you right now, when you think you're in control, you're not. I'm going to prove that to you in a minute. Giving up control is no longer caring about who gets the credit. Now, I won't lie, it took me a long time to reach that point. And that's probably true for most of us. A young boy was praying and he said, Dear God, please take care of mom and dad and my sister and brother and all my friends. But most of all, take care of yourself. Anything happened to you, we'd be in big trouble. So part of giving up control is realizing that God is the source. He's the sovereign God. He's always in control. We just need to acknowledge it. Well, there's a second way we can give up control. That's by realizing that control only leads us to a rough place. If you look at verses 31 through 33, we see what happened to Nebuchadnezzar as a result of him taking credit and control. Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms of the earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. Immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from the people. He ate grass like an ox, his body drenched with the dew of heaven, until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. In other words, he didn't get to clip his nails. You know what happens when you don't clip your nails, right? That's just one of the things that was going on. So the consequences of retaining control are always dire. Now, this is not talking about being lazy. This is not talking about taking our due diligence. This is not talking about getting our lives done in a meaningful way. It's not what it's talking about at all. God gave us a brain. He gave us a body. We're to use that. We just need to understand our limitations. And that while we can do what He's given us a brain to do, ultimately, He's the one who makes it happen. So there's consequences if we insist on leaving Him out of the equation. The king's pride and desire for control took him to a place where he lost all of it. His authority was taken away. He was driven away from the people. He lived like an animal. He would suffer the effects of that until he finally came to his senses. You see, in many ways, this is a paradox. If we wish to have control, we need to give it up. If we want to have life, we must lose it for God's sake. Self-denial results in self-affirmation by God. If we deny ourselves, take up our cross and follow Christ. It's just so opposite to what we tend to do. It's not easy to grasp. God lifts up the humble. He brings down the prideful. It's pretty clear. We saw that in the first verse that we read in James. So our spiritual life needs to be one that is submitted to God. We don't want it to look like King Nebuchadnezzar's, because it'll be in shambles if we're unwilling to give control to God. I think we get out into the world, we get out into society, and we deal with difficult situations and difficult people, and obviously we want to control, and we want to control because we want to protect ourselves, and I just think we need to understand that that's a little bit of an illusion, that ultimately we aren't in control. We don't know what's going to happen. I'm sure that Alan thought he'd be the last person in the world, and we all feel this way, who would get COVID-19. I mean, if you want to know how it feels to be out of control, talk to Alan a few minutes about his experience with COVID-19. There's always something that you can't control. And we need to give that to God. And then we need to make sure that we leave it in His hands. So what we tend to do is we put it in His hands and we take it back. We bought Spencer a Camaro. Most of you know that. He's very proud of his car, and he takes pretty good care of it, actually, so far. However, he did get his first ticket finally. $200, which he's going to have to pay. He's now broke. I told him, I said, now if you really want to get back on your feet, get a few more of those tickets. They'll take your license away. You won't be able to drive. You'll have to walk. Oh, really? I said, yeah, you get points on your license. Just when we think we've got control, we discover that maybe we don't so much. The police, he told me, he said the police pulled him over, and he was on Highway 50 going through Lee Summit, which is the safe, 60 miles an hour. Well, apparently one of his friends who has a Mustang, I guess they were just racing a little bit, decided to, and so the policeman pulled him over and said, yeah, I saw you racing that Mustang. And see, we test our ability sometimes to be in control. We push that envelope a little bit. Eventually, it will take us to a bad place. And God always has a way of cutting us down to size. Remember the phrase, well, I think you're a little bit too big for your britches? You remember that one, yeah. We don't use that too much anymore, I'm sorry, but you remember that. Sometimes that's the way we are. And then, number 3, this is the third way in which we can give up control, by recognizing that only God can get us to the right place. That took me a while to figure that out too. Verse 34 and 37, it says, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar's finally starting to speak up here, say a few different kinds of things. He says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. So basically, when we think we have control, we're insane to think that. And he says, my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified Him who lives forever. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as He pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back His hand or say to Him, what have you done? Remember when Job was complaining, and goodness, Job got a bad deal for sure, and he was complaining, and God even said to Job, did you put the moon in the sky? Did you put the stars there? Well, no. All right. I'm God and you're not. At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. So once he humbled himself, once he went to God and said, God, I messed this up. I took credit. I should have given it to you. Remember, God lifts up the humble. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. But he was given all the credit to God. God was the source of all this. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Geez, what a great story. That's a great short story, but it's a good one. So we must acknowledge who God is and what he has done. You know how tempting it is to take credit or seek credit for what God has done or is doing. Or we blame him for what's not happening. And yet he's still in control. All good things come from God. That's a passage of Scripture. And the Greek word for all is the word all. Pretty clear. That being true, is there ever any instance where we can take the credit? No. The king learned the hard way and finally acknowledged that God was God and he was not. And we tend to be like the king. We have to learn the hard way. We tend to take the scenic route. It's our stubbornness and our pride that takes us to that bad place. Bad enough that we finally realize that we must humble ourselves, turn from our evil ways, and pray, and then God will heal our land and ourselves. You probably are familiar with that little paraphrase of that scripture. You know, COVID-19, whatever your opinion is, has brought our country to its knees in many ways. Yet still some are insistent on keeping control. And yes, we can take precautions, and we should, and we do, but we need to be logical and not stupid. Because control is an illusion. You know, let me tell you where I learned about the lack of control. Now, there's lots of places you can learn it, and I could mention many more, but these are a couple of places that you can understand pretty easily. And just maybe they're trivial examples, but I think you understand where I'm coming from. Here's where I learned the illusion of control. Children's sermons and coaching junior high football. We have 2 or 3 really, really good players this year. One of them is the quarterback, another one is a running back, another one is a wide receiver, and they're all buddies. And every once in a while they get a little overconfident. They start talking what we call talking trash, but it's not necessarily a negative thing or a bad thing other than the fact they're talking about themselves, you know. And so Mason is really good friends with Michael, the quarterback, and so Michael, he was just talking all kinds of trash and stuff. And so I went over to Mason. I said, Mason, how do you put up with Michael? And Michael says, Mason says, you just have to embrace him and become like him. Okay, and so then I go over to Michael and I said, Michael, did you hear what Mason said? He said that I just have to embrace you and be like you. And he says, well, how do you think Evan got so good? I mean, you know, it's at that point where you realize I have no control over these players. So, and the same thing happens in children's sermons. You know, all the kids talk at once, and you've seen that happen with me. You've seen it happen with Jennifer when we were doing children's sermons. And here's what I've realized is that, you know what, I just need to let that go and let God control that. Now, after our first game, the head varsity coach comes over, and we won the game 32-6. It was a decisive victory. And Coach Burke comes over. Now, he's a big teddy bear, but he's also tough. He came over, and Michael and Evan, the two I mentioned earlier, not Mason, but Michael and Evan, had decided to wear a different color sock than they were supposed to wear. I was going to talk to him after the game. I had no idea Coach Burke was going to come over. But he came over to the group. He said, I don't want to rain on your parade, but two of your best players, they don't have the correct uniform on. And I know that Coach Hutton said many times on Group Me and in announcements to you that you were supposed to wear long black socks. And they weren't. He said, you better get with the program, because if you can't, you might as well just transfer. Now, these two are potential varsity players. Well, I got some apologies after that. I got some emails after that of, I'm so sorry, Coach Hutton. That will not happen again. There you go. So I didn't really even need to control it. God had it. God already had it. And actually, I was glad for Coach Burke to be the bad guy. But he wasn't being a bad guy. He was just, being tough. But this is how things work. It's just so hard for us to get into that groove of not overreacting and not overprotecting and not over-controlling. We all tend to be we want to be micromanagers. Me too. I can get that way. I can be that way. In 2 Corinthians 1, 8 to 10b, 8b to 10b, it says, we are under great pressure far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, in our hearts we felt the sentence of death, but this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but rely on God, who raised us from the dead. He has delivered us from such a deadly peril, and He will deliver us. And on Him we have set our hope that He will continue to deliver us. Giving God control keeps us from overreaction. Makes us stop and think before we lose control, before we say something that we shouldn't. The best we can really do is manage. That's why in baseball, they call a coach a manager. He manages. It's all we can do. There's no need for reaction. Just acknowledge that God has entrusted to you the opportunity to manage His plan under His leadership. And then giving God control keeps us from overprotecting. We need to stop defending God. He doesn't need our defense. He doesn't need us to protect Him. He can do it by Himself. And we need to stop protecting our preferences. God doesn't need our preferences. He's already written it up in the Bible the way it ought to be done. And that's exactly how we ought to do it. And giving God control keeps us from overseeing. Now, it talks about in the Bible that elders are to be overseers. But what I'm talking about here is overseeing. Looking constantly over the shoulder of God, making sure He does it right or does it our way. The only way we can stop micromanaging is to stop overseeing. We need to oversee, but not oversee, as in too much. If we have control of every little thing, God will make sure that ultimately we will control no thing. Giving up control is the most difficult thing that we can do as human beings. It's just hard. Yet it's the only way God can work because He will not violate our free will. If you want control, He'll give it to you. But you'll end up where Nebuchadnezzar was in some form or fashion. You see, Jesus said something very important when He was in the Garden of Gethsemane right before the cross. He wanted that to be, that cup, to be passed. He didn't want to have to deal with that. And then what did He finally say? Jesus said, "Not my will, but your will be done." Once you stop arguing with God about that, you'll be able to give up control. And that's what He wants us to do. Give that up to Him. And then He can trust you with His purpose and plan. Let's pray. Father,